Hi there everyone! For this second video for week 1 of Introduction to Philosophy, today we're really going to get into what is philosophy, right? What is the point of taking this class? Why should you study philosophy? What is its history, right? These are all, I think, natural questions for you coming into a class, right? If you go into a political science class or an anatomy class, one of the first questions that you should have answered is, well, what is political science, right? What is anatomy? What is, the content of whatever course that you're going to take, right? And philosophy is a very interesting and unique discipline. It is very much unlike various other classes that you might take, right? And here's what I mean, right? If you're in an anatomy class and you have an exam, and your exam asks you for the bones in whatever area of the body, in a normal human body or something like that, there's a right answer and a wrong answer. If you're in a mathematics class, right, you have an equation, maybe algebraic equation or something like that, right, and solve for x. Well, there's a value for x, and there are values that are wrong, that don't work, right? And a lot of education is the process of filling you up with information like that, right? They want you to know the names and the dates and the times and, know how to solve certain formulas and equations, to know all the facts, say, about anatomy or whatever, right? And that is really the model for what a lot of American education is like, right? It's reflected in the importance that we place on STEM education, where, in, STEM fields, there often is a right or a wrong answer that's easily determinable, right? But in the humanities, right, in the social sciences, once you introduce any sort of human being into the mix, then things become a lot more complicated. And so philosophy, you might start out by saying, well, what is subject matter, right? If anatomy is about the human body, if biology is about life, if physics is about, nature, then what is philosophy first and foremost about, right? And the answer that you have to give is kind of paradoxical in a way. I love this quote from this American philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars, where he said, philosophy is about how things, in the broadest possible sense of that term, come together. In the broadest possible sense of that term. Right? So what does that mean? He said something very, very vague, it seems like, right? Well, what philosophy does is that philosophy picks up the pieces of questions that aren't answered by other disciplines, right? So, for example, in biology class, right, you might learn about various characteristics of life, right? Life reproduces itself, life, is a sort of self-sustaining system, and so on and so forth, right? And you learn all of these characteristics of what we call life, right? But you might have a further, deeper question that's like, well, but what is life? Like, what is this thing that's displaying all of these characteristics? Or is one of these characteristics more fundamental than another characteristic? How would you determine that, right? Or similarly in mathematics, right? Mathematics, you might have an algebraic equation where you have to solve for x, right? And giving the right answer, being able to formulate the correct value for x is then part of what mathematics is about. But if you think about you might ask other questions. For example, you might ask, well, what are numbers? What are mathematical facts? What are we talking about, right? And these are the sort of questions that is the sort of information-based approach that many of classes are set up and structured around can't really address, right? There's no way that you could conduct a physical experiment to figure out why experiments work, right? Um, all experiments, all scientific, accounts, approaches, etc., assume something like a theoretical framework, right? They require accounts of motion, of time, of number, of relationship, right? And what philosophy is philosophy steps in and essentially scoops up all of the questions that other disciplines can't or won't answer, right? And this gets us back to Seller's definition that philosophy is how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, fit together, right? So just to give another example, right? Philosophy of biology might ask about what is life. It might ask about how biological experiments are conducted. It might ask about the ethics of animal research, right? The questions that are not addressed, not within the purview of biology itself, right? Linguistics might explain, as another example, how it is that sounds change, for example, in an accent. If you take a linguistics class, one thing that you'll learn is you'll learn how to chart out the different sounds that are in a language, and then to be able to describe in a more formal way, how accents perhaps, shift vowel sounds and things like that, right? And so you might be able to differentiate like my little bit of a southern accent from, maybe a normal, I don't know what that means, East Coast, American accent or something like that, right? But philosophy of language steps in and asks questions like, well, what is a word? What is a unit of meaning? What does it mean to mean something? Right? What's going on when we intend to mean something in language, and how does it work? Right? So philosophy deals with the theoretical questions that are unaddressed, left over from other disciplines. And so the nature of philosophy is that its questions are, in a way, unresolved, right? Um, the exact reason why we have to do philosophy of biology, right, instead of just biology, is that we have questions and problems about the idea of life, right? But we don't have a solution. We don't have an account that is fully satisfactory to everybody involved, right? And so in a way, the subject area of philosophy is very, very wide. You can take up any discipline you want, and there's some amount of philosophical questions that are asked about it and that are relevant to it, right? Philosophy, you might think about, is one of the first real theoretical disciplines, right? Philosophy is born as soon as people ask, what is this? What is this world? What should we do? What am I? How do I live? Right? These questions could never be answered through a simple scientific experiment, and so we're forced into the situation where we just have to reason about it, right? We have to take in whatever the available evidence is and provide a perspective of some kind, right? So this is why philosophy is very often considered kind of central to education, right? Why is it central to education? Well, because oftentimes the foundations of certain disciplines have their roots in philosophy. So we've been talking about biology a lot, for example. Well, one of the, kind of earliest biologists, for example, is Aristotle, who is an ancient Greek philosopher, right? And he was really more interested in philosophical questions. But to answer those philosophical questions, he, had this one of the earliest studies of life, right, of animals. And an account of how animals are different from plants, and they in turn are different from human beings. Many of the foundational concepts of biology and ways of approaching it came out of Aristotle, right? Obviously, there's a lot of other important elements of biology as we know it today, right? Things are totally different after Charles Darwin, for example. You have natural selection. But that example, I think, really just goes to show how philosophy is often at the core in some way of every other discipline. This includes even disciplines you wouldn't think of, right? There's philosophy of business administration, there's philosophy of computer science, there's philosophy of data management. And so, philosophy by its nature has an extremely wide area, right? It's not like you're just studying life, or you're just studying physical nature, or you're just studying how language works, or something like that. You're studying the leftover theoretical questions that sort of attach to every single discipline. And so that's why philosophy for me is really so fun and so unique and so empowering, right? Philosophy, unlike these other disciplines, isn't about what kind of information you can spit out, but it's about what you think, right? It's about how to think about certain kinds of problems that come up in your life, right? In this class in particular is oriented around certain kinds of existential questions, right? That doesn't mean that we're only going to be reading the existentialists or something like that, although we are reading a little bit of them. But it means that these questions that we're going to focus on in this introduction to philosophy class are questions about how to live your life, right? My thinking about this kind of focus is like, hey, maybe not everyone here is going to continue taking philosophy classes or something like that, right? We don't need to do philosophy of biology because not all of us are going to be biologists, right? But one thing that's true of all of us is that we have to live a life, we have to suffer, we have to die at some point, and we have to reckon with the fact that we live in a world where we suffer, we die, we feel alienated, and we, seek some sort of meaning out of life, right? I think that that is a universal experience among human beings, is this quest to discover meaning, right? And so what we're going to do is just take the best resources in the history of philosophy, right? And you could have totally written this syllabus an entirely different way. But for me, when I reflect on all the things that I've read, all the things I've had to read, in all the classes I've taken, I've tried to give you the very best and the most important, most pointed and motivated works in the history of philosophy that I know of, that try to be really serious in asking how we should all live our lives, right? And so the nature of this is that no one is an expert, right? No one's an expert in how, you should live your life. Maybe you could be an expert in one of the philosophers that we discussed, like Plato or something like that, right? But again, what your expertise is in is not living the good life or something like that. Your expertise is in reading Plato. No one is an expert in living a good life, because living a good life is something immensely challenging and difficult. And most people that I think, would say that they lived a good life, they spent a whole life getting there, right? So we're going to reflect what makes a life worth living, right? How do we deal with the fact that the world is marked by all these things that seem imperfect, things that we suffer from, right? Um, we'll also reflect on love, the fact that life is filled with love, and what does that mean? Does love perhaps make life meaningful? We'll reflect on certainty and uncertainty, and maybe what it is to act morally, or what it means to live a life that you can truly, sign off on in one way or another. So this leads me to transition a little bit to the Immanuel Kant reading that I asked you to do for this first week. You might notice that the Kant reading is fairly short, and that's intentional, right? This first week, we really want to just kind of get oriented around what philosophy is. And Kant is challenging, this is material that was written a couple of 100 years ago, right? And it shows in various ways. But what we want to do is we want to try to see how these historical sources can continue to speak with us today, right now, right? And the way that I think that the Kant material does this is specifically in his conception of what the Enlightenment is, right? Of what an enlightened attitude is. And this is going to be something that we discuss again, actually, at the very end of the course. In the reading, the opening line of the essay is that Kant says that enlightenment is freedom from one's self-imposed immaturity. That's a very interesting definition, right? So on the one hand, he's closely linking enlightenment with education, right? So to be enlightened is to be educated, right? It's to no longer be immature, as he says, right? But he doesn't mean immature in the way that, we might like scold an adolescent or something like that, right? Instead, he means immature in a very precise philosophical sense. And for Kant, to be immature is to be incapable of acting on your own reasons. So, for example, right, if you have a young child, very young child, and they need to eat, right, and they don't want to eat, you can't simply rely on their own decision making at this point. They say that they don't want to eat, right? You know better for the child, right? You can use your reason, you can figure out what is the best thing for the child in this situation and decide for them, right? And so that's what makes children immature, right? Is that they're not ready to use their own reason. But you might also, Kant at least opens this possibility of thinking about immaturity not as just something that happens because you're young, right? But he says a self-imposed immaturity, right? And so what he has in mind is a kind of, you might say, arrested development, right? You're supposed to grow up, you're supposed to become mature, you're supposed to start thinking for yourself, but now, you've come to rely on someone else to do your thinking for you, right? You might think about, all of our concerns about social media, right? That really inflame a lot of today's political discussion, right? One thing that, everyone hates about social media is that it, it's very easy to let other people do your thinking for you, right? And so for Kant, when you're immature, when you're still relying on others to decide things for you, to figure things out for you, to show you the way, then you have a kind of self-incurred immaturity. Enlightenment, then, is the process of getting over that. Enlightenment, therefore, is the process of thinking for yourself. It's removing all of the handicaps, all of the tools, all of the shortcuts that are given to you by our educational system, and having to, for the first time, really lay down what it is that you believe, not just what other people tell you to believe, but what you believe for yourself. So for Kant, philosophy, enlightenment, is a project of human freedom, right? What do I mean by that? Philosophy is related to human freedom because it's now what was previously externally imposed upon you becomes something that you make your own. You make it your own decision, right? You're no longer taking your thoughts, your beliefs, how you should act from someone else, but now you're beginning to think about it on your own, right? And this is why I think the introduction to philosophy classes are so interesting and so exciting, right? In every other class that you have, or at least very many other classes that you have, your job is to get information, and it's to become technically skilled in some way. In this class, your goal is to develop your own thinking, to develop your own freedom, for you to figure out how it is that you think is best to live. And I've tried to structure and orient the course around those questions. Kant also makes really interesting, nuanced, detailed points, right, about this, right? You might think, well, if everyone just thinks for themselves and no one has to follow any rules, then you have anarchy or something like that, right? And Kant has this thought too. And so he, tries to think about, okay, what are the contexts where it's appropriate for you to reason on your own, to be enlightened? And what are the contexts where, you really have to obey and submit to authority that is imposed on you? And Kant's answer is actually like the direct inverse of what you might expect from a traditional American context. Kant is a, German Enlightenment philosopher. And so what he has to say is that you don't need to submit to authority. You can use your reason on your own when you're using your reason publicly. But you might have to limit yourself in certain private situations, right? What does he mean by that? Well, if you're in the army, all right, you chose to be, at least, in United States context, etc. You chose to be, part of the military, right? And there's a chain of command that is part of that, right? And so maybe you don't agree with what your superior is telling to you, but in those cases, you have to obey, right? Similarly, like maybe I don't like, that there's an attendance policy, or that you have to take a final exam or something like that. But hey, C&M, they make the rules, right? They have requirements for what classes look like. And so in this case, I have to say, yeah, fair enough, right? It's not that onerous anyway, right? But what Kant says is that I can always use my reason publicly, right? So in other words, I could write an article and submit it to the Albuquerque Journal or something like that, where I say like, hey, I think that this is a bad idea. Similarly, you might imagine our, military personnel that we were discussing earlier. Maybe you can't directly disobey an order from your superior, because it's life or death situation, right? There's a chain of command. It's important to maintain the chain of command. But you can always use your reason publicly. You can always state that you are like opposed to a war, for example, things like that, right? And Kant says that in using your reason publicly like that, you're acting as a citizen of the world, right? You're not just acting as, you know, whatever rank you are in the military, a private or whatever, and you're not just acting, in my case, like as a C&M employee, but you can always step back from that and enter the public arena and reason with everyone as a global citizen about what we should do, who we are, and what makes life worth living, what we should do, right, in all of these cases. Okay, I'm going to cut the video off there. You might disagree with Kant about what the appropriate limits of using your reason are. That's totally okay. That's great. I'm excited to talk about it, bring it up in your discussion forum for this week. It's been really, really fun explaining some of the basics of philosophy to you and also comparing it to the short Immanuel Kant text that we read for this week. I hope that you have a great first week of class and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.